everybody. Good evening. How beautiful to see such a full house on such a great day. For such a truly amazing cause. So it's so great to see you all out. And all the proceeds will go to Julian, of course. Lawyers are very expensive these days, so please give generously if you can. Nothing for technical talks. So we're delighted today to have John Shipton, Julian's dad, come all the way up from Melbourne with his mighty band of warriors to talk to us up here on the Northern Rivers. And you're doing Brisbane and Nimbin and Lismore and of course Mullumbimby, the centre of the universe. So we're very happy to have you here. Okay. And we're also very lucky to have Mia Armitage come, and she's going to give some questions to John to stimulate him, and then at the very end we can have a Q&A. So if you have any questions come up, please make a mental note of them so that you can ask John after. And Mia works for Bay FM and the Echo, and I'm very proud to announce, I don't know how many of you know, that Bay FM actually won the award for the best community radio in the whole of Australia. And also delighted to have one of our Byronshire councillors here, Duncan Day. You can begin coming this way. And he's going to tell you all about the motion that he got passed through Byronshire Council recently to, I believe, send a letter to the government and Anthony Albanese. Come up, Duncan, and he's going to tell you all about that. But I would like to, John gave me permission to share a couple of amazing tidbits of news with you. I thought he'd like to share them himself. But you all probably know that Anthony Albanese sent a letter to the US administration saying he thought it was time that Julian came home. And at the same time, 5 major world newspapers sent a similar letter saying that 12 years in jail is enough, 12 years in confinement, and that was The Guardian, The New York Times, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, and Der Pass. So 5 incredibly important newspapers, in fact all of whom published Julian's revelations, so they very much should be announcing these things. And also a bit of good news is Daniel, who released the Pentagon Papers, I forget his surname, he also stood up recently and said, well look, if Julian's in prison, I should be in prison too, or I should be under similar circumstances. So all of a sudden there's all of this pressure coming in this united wave of enthusiasm for Julian. And it just gives me goosebumps and also like tears to my eyes to think that I really feel like this is the beginning of the end. I just pray so. And so all of our energy tonight going towards Julian, sending him all our love and all our wishes for total freedom. Thank you.
Let's acknowledge that we're on Bundjalung country. They're the First Nations tribe of this area. Let's pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and let's acknowledge that this land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I'm not pivotal in this campaign, but I was so honoured to be able to play a very small part, and that was following a rally that the local group of Free Julian Assange, the local group ran down in Byron, and I thought, well, what can I do? So I met with the group and constructed a notice of motion. That's the element where a councillor can take a proposal to Byronshire Council. That we did in, I forget when it was, a couple of months ago, and the proposal was that the Byronshire Council write to people who are keeping Julian under lock and key. So the proposal was successful, the councillors passed it, but the Mayor wrote letters. One was to President Joe Biden, the second one was to Prime Minister Albanese, and the third one to Senator Penny Wong, and I'll leave those letters for the group. I don't have a lot more to say than that. I believe that if the tables were turned, and let's say Australia was hanging on to an American citizen for very, very nebulous reasons, what would happen is that a Black Hawk helicopter would land wherever that American citizen was being held, blow everything up, and extract the citizen and fly them to freedom. And I would, I shouldn't say this, I'd support that happening for Julian.
Thank you, Duncan. That's so great by Andrew. And I believe there were some other councils around Australia who joined in with that. I'd like to bring you up, John. Shipton, please. And also Mia, if you'd like to come up as well. Let's have a warm round of applause for our mighty warrior, John Shipton.
Thank you. Like coming home to family. First thing, I'd like to thank the Bundjalung mob for the hospitality that they've offered my family and myself for the last 150 years of. So, thanks, fellas. All of life's best described by poetry. This I won't read the whole thing, it's not so long anyway, but it's W.B. Yeats, you probably know it well. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falconer cannot hear the falcon. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity.
Why?
It ends a gaze and blank and pitiless as the sun moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel the shadows of indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast its hour came round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. I start with that for the purpose of using Julian as an emblematic of a collapse in human rights, in the conventions of asylum, in due process. In 1948, Herbert Bear Evatt, an Australian, along with Eleanor Roosevelt, put together the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the United Nations. An Australian was first president of the United Nations, intimately involved in its construction, and author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights along with Eleanor Roosevelt. 1958, the Conventions of Asylum were promulgated. Australia in 1974 Christmas, at the United Nations General Assembly, authored the presentation and ratification of the Conventions of Asylum, which were adopted in an unusual majority of only 16 abstentions. Julian Assange was an asylee under those conventions put together by Australia and adapted to the United Nations General Assembly. Next, due process. 800 years ago at Runnymede, you might know, that a shield was instituted between the sovereign and the people, in our case the state and the people. A body of laws which the sovereign or the state had to relate to the people, and we had to relate to the sovereign through that body of laws and each other. Really important. This resulted in what we know as due process. Due process simply means in the English version that each side is equally armed. Julian, in the court hearing of 3 weeks, was in a glass box at the back of the court with an elevated platform and slots 30 millimetres wide every metre, so you could hear. To speak to his barristers and solicitors, he had to get on his knees and whisper through the 30 millimetre slot. The barrister or solicitor on the other side had to stand on their tippy toes and press their ear against the slot. The prosecution sat in the well of the court. So the defence appealed to the judge and said, no, this is unfair, this is abuse. This is abuse of process. We request that you give permission to Julian to sit in the well of the court. The judge said, oh, look, that's not up to me, that's up to the jail, because he's the prisoner of the jail. Anyway, the jail said, well, that's not up to us, that's up to the judge. Abuse. And I give that example of abuse. This was really profound what the English did at Runnymede. You'll know it as the Magna Carta. And it's a civilizational artifact that's spread right around the world and embraced by every nation. It's so automatic to us that we don't even notice its existence because we rely upon it like fish in water or people in air. After the World War II, the people of the world gathered together and instituted another magnificent civil artifact. We call it the United Nations, and embraced within the United Nations an invention of an Australian, Herbert Vere Evatt, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 4 in the Human Rights Declaration has been constantly abrogated in the case of Julian Assange. The Conventions of Asylum. Julian was an asylee. It is a process. At the time Australia introduced the Conventions of Asylum to the United Nations General Assembly, there were 10,000 people in Santiago in missions of one sort or another in asylum. For we know in our hearts that sometimes the state feels really insecure and takes out its rage on the population. We know that. So we put together these glorious artifacts, the Conventions of Asylum. Julian was given asylum in Ecuador. There's a process to be given and a process to be removed. The removal in the case of Julian Assange was ignored. They got a $2 billion loan from the IMF. 12 United States senators wrote a letter to Lenin Monaro saying, you know, we're not going to forget this, you fellas. You're giving Julian Assange asylum. And so they removed it in the most hilarious, tragic circumstances. hilarious because after Julian, they called it Operation Pelican, led by Sir Alan Duncan, who was a Minister of State Under Secretary in the United Kingdom. After Julian was locked up, they celebrated their corrupted victory where they had suborned the conventions of asylum. He went to Buckingham Palace gift shop and he bought a lovely plate there from the gift shop and flew to Quito in Ecuador and presented the lovely plate from Buckingham Palace gift shop to Lenin Moreno. I mean, what an insult to a president. So that's why I read that poem, because Julian is emblematic in two ways. One, of the collapse of these glorious, magnificent artifacts that we've taken 1,000 years and 100 million deaths to establish, and the wreckage of 40 countries in the Second World War. We did it, and after the war it embraced our hearts and we established these things. For we know their goodness, and we know their facility, and we know what we are like on occasion. So we have to have means for states to relate through laws, and to each other through laws, social laws and statute laws and regulation. We know about ourselves. We mature and institute these things, and they are wonderful, and we fight for them. So the second part is that Julian being emblematic and an Australian. Now remember that he grew out of this soil. What I call this soil is when you see an Aborigine walking along, or Indigenous people walking along, you see the soil and blood of the land animated in a human being. When you see Julian Assange, you see the soil and blood of the social structure of Australia in person, animated, for that's what we are like. Some people say we're a little innocent, but I don't think so. So in the defence of Julian, every single European Parliament has an Assange group. Every parliament, even not Strasbourg, the smallest parliament, Luxembourg, has an Assange group. Some are extraordinary, like Greece has 300 parliamentarians and 90 in the Assange group. He could go there and be Prime Minister. Extraordinary. Australia has 50. Even Japan has 2. And those, they're a bit out of the way. The United Kingdom has an Assange group, cross-party. Germany has such a large Assange cross-party group that Julian Assange is on the official agenda, is an official agenda item on the United States-Germany Friendship Group. Every president in South America, well, I better say every major president in South America, supports the freedom of Julian Assange. The latest being Lula, president-elect, just received the WikiLeaks crew. The other, you'll see in a minute here, he'll show you that we were invited by AMLO, that's his affectionate nickname, the President Obrador of Mexico. We were invited there to attend their Independence Day celebration Now, Mexico has fought 6 wars for its independence, and it knows the meaning of independence and what you've got to do to keep it. Important to remember. They knew. One event we went to, they read out the cables that had allowed Mexico to understand the arrangements that their government was making with the United States, and as a consequence change and regain some of their independence. I would just remind that, you know, there's 35 million Mexicans living in the southern United States, and the trade with America is about $500 billion a year, just around about the same as China's. We don't notice Mexico, but it is vital, an important North American state. You want to show those? Yeah.
Damas y caballeros, damos la bienvenida a las distinguidas personalidades que presiden esta a la ceremonia de nombramiento como huésped distinguido a Julian Assange, hermano de Julian Assange. Muchas gracias, sean tan amables de tomar asiento.
Por eso el Gobierno de México ha hecho, a través del presidente de la República, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, esta petición al Gobierno de Estados Unidos de que se le conceda el asilo político y el refugio en nuestro país a Julian Assange.
Una foto, ¿no? Algo así.
It moves us almost to tears, the generosity and the substance of the gift of the keys to the city of Mexico. It is as if Mexico City, like a mother hen, takes her chicks under her wings to protect them. That's us. That's Australians being welcomed by Mexico for their Independence Day. So adding another element to our understanding that this ground, this soil, this blood is good stuff. There's no need at all to look elsewhere than other inside and amongst us, inside ourselves and amongst us. And so Julian has become emblematic of the repair of those magnificent civil artefacts that were put together in the late 20th century, and the one we inherited from Runnymede, Magna Carta. You might think, that my conversation's a little bit too sort of weighty, but the subject matter is a bit concerning. And I'd like to thank Prime Minister Anthony Albanese for making, because as you know, in politics, words are actions. And I remember watching Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, answering another magnificent woman, Monique Ryan's question in Parliament. She's a Teal as supporter. Behind Anthony was Richard Marles. He led out a sigh. Well, I give Richard a bit of stick and a lot of praise to Anthony for his support, and to the 40 others in the Parliament who receive us and give us encouragement. So the last part, I'll say, so that's the balancing of the collapse, the emblematic collapse in Julian Assange's case, and the rebuilding that's happening around us in the Assange matter, as people see that these institutions need to be strengthened and rebuilt.
John Shipton, thank you so much for outlining what you have quite rightly described as a very weighty situation. And thank you for reminding us of what is at stake. If I would use one word to sum up your amazing introduction to the history of due process, I would say democracy. And that democracy is what is at stake here. And it seems that finally some of those very well respected international media outlets who originally collaborated with your son to let us know what was happening at the hands of the military in the United States, it's great to see that they too have recognised what is at stake. And for them, of course, we know that journalists, our work is at stake too over in the United States. But it's good for us to be reminded that it's more than just journalists we're talking about here. It's a human being. This is a human being, and he's an Australian. He's one of ours. He's from the Northern Rivers, and welcome back to the Northern Rivers.
Thank you.
So many of the questions I had planned to ask you, you have already very eloquently answered. So I'll try not to be repetitive. But I do want to start, as you say, here in Australia. Let's come back inside the tent. And with the Prime Minister, I appreciate you've acknowledged that words in politics are actions. So far, though, the only word we've really heard Mr Albanese use when he describes any kind of a goal for an outcome for Julian Assange is closure. A lot of people say that that word is pretty ambiguous, and in fact could include the worst possible outcome. There's obviously room for it to include the best possible outcome, which would be for Julian Assange to live somewhere in peace and harmony with his loved ones, free. I wonder what your take is on the use of that word closure. I know you have a lot at stake too, and I'm sure you'll be choosing your words carefully.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just take it in the positive, and we work towards that. I mean, if I were to take closure in the negative and think that my Prime Minister is advocating that Julian spent 175 years in jail, I would think the place is nuts and I couldn't bear to live here any longer. So I take it in the positive, and taking it in the positive, we use our energies and wits to ensure that it is fulfilled in the positive. I had some time with the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Penny Wong, who states that we have made representations. And then the Prime Minister, an hour later, says closure. Well, you wouldn't make representations in order that the person, the concern over that person, Julian Assange, got you elected into government, because we characterised the last election as an Assange election. All of those candidates that were elected in the government, the Teals, the Greens, the Independents, all of them without exception stood on the Assange platform. So they're going to make representations to bring about closure and have him locked up for 175 years. It's too mad. It's too mad to actually bear and remain on this earth.
John Shipton, you just said then that some of these people who have gotten into our federal parliament in the recent election stood on an Assange platform. That isn't something that was discussed very widely or prominently in mainstream media coverage of the election. We did hear a little bit about climate change and calls for greater climate action, although many have said that even those calls were overshadowed in mainstream media coverage of the election in favour of topics such as cost of living, interest rates. We had a gas crisis, they were calling it an energy crisis. However, as you've rightly pointed out on Twitter, there's been a big survey done, and 3.5 million, it was Pratima who pointed that out at the start. 80% of those survey respondents said that they wanted Julian Assange to be free. Here in Australia, Essential Media does very professional surveys every week on hot topics across the country. They've recently done a survey and 88% of Australians who responded to their survey said they want to see the prosecution against Julian Assange dropped and for him to be brought home. So it's fair to say that the support for your son hasn't dwindled. Your efforts haven't gone to waste. There's always been that grassroots campaign. You've managed to sustain it. Anyone in this room who's seen Ithaca will know that it's not easy for you. It hasn't been easy for you, and you do sometimes have moments of pessimism. We saw a couple of those moments in Ithaca. You're only human. Yeah, but you say that you feel that the tables have turned partly based on the response of these new politicians in our parliament to the sentiments of Australians. I just wonder, do you think that's going to be enough? Is it going to be enough? And do you think that someone like the ABC will join the ranks of those international news outlets in calling for the charges against Mr. Assange to be dropped? Surely a move on the part of the ABC like that would be very significant and put extra pressure on our government.
Yes, that's a good question. The ABC had put on Ithaca in 2 parts. It was 580,000 views when I last looked. Pretty good. And so the ABC has changed its ways. I haven't rung up anybody in the ABC to ask them to sign up, because of course they benefited greatly from the WikiLeaks publications over the years. But it's a good, I will do that.
An opportunity there for another petition, perhaps?
Yes, there's lots of petitions going on AssangeCampaign.org. Just go and sign yet another petition. It does help.
Yeah, I wonder, do you know how many people, Australians, have signed that record? I think it was a record-breaking petition started by a fellow called Philip Adams, not to be confused with the well-known ABC presenter Philip Adams, but Philip Adams had a huge petition. Hundreds of thousands of people had signed it. Do you know how many that got up to in the end?
The last time I looked at 820,000. There was a preceding petition in Germany that got up to 450,000 back in the day when Julian was having difficulty reaching people, and in the United Kingdom 350,000. I think that was 8 years ago.
Okay, so yeah, huge support, as I say, for Julian Assange. Now, I know that you want to focus on the positives, but we have to be real as well, realistic. So the current situation really is that the UK High Court has approved an extradition request from the United States. We haven't heard Joe Biden, unless he said something today that I've missed, I haven't heard Joe Biden give any kinds of encouraging words along the lines of those heard from our Prime Minister yet. Do you have any update on that? Has Joe Biden used words like closure?
No, I haven't heard anything from Joe Biden. I mean, with the United Kingdom, I think it's item 2 in the Nuremberg Code. It says that what you do, you are responsible for. You can't say somebody told me to do it and then go off and commit a crime. That's no excuse. That's how I feel about the United Kingdom. They have committed. I'll just give you one example. I gave you the judges, the example of the abuse of due process. This is the abuse of evidentiary standards. 9 FBI agents under what's called a derogatory permission travelled to Iceland and interviewed a man named Thor Darson, a convicted paedophile and a convicted fraudster, promising immunity of persecution to Thor Darson. They got him to state that Julian had proposed to break into a computer in Iceland. Okay. That's then the Justice Minister of Iceland heard about this and ordered the FBI agent removed. This testimony from Thor Darson was included in the charges against Julian Assange. I'll outline that. There's no judicial base at all. This is the United States suborning a witness in Iceland to testify about a crime, a proposed crime, a charge, in Iceland on an Australian to be held in the United Kingdom court for extradition to the United States. It's impossible. There's no judicial foundation for that at all. No, but it was accepted by.
Is that, sorry to interrupt you there, but is it that particular witness, is it that testimony that leads the path to the appeal, the upcoming appeal in the UK?
No. He's since recanted, but what the appeal is based on 14 points. What they are has never been released, so I don't know what they are. There's a appeal. The appeal is before one judge, and he judges the matter on the papers, just on the papers, no hearing. If that fails, then the defence can appeal, and it'll be heard by 2 judges in open court. If that fails, Julian is immediately extradited to the United States, except that there's currently an appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. Again, I don't know the details of that.
Okay, I appreciate you don't know the details of that one, but there have been questions raised as to whether or not the UK will even participate in that process because of Brexit and the fact that technically maybe they're no longer part of that jurisdiction. What's the latest that you've heard about that potential?
There's still, so that the Brexit is uncompleted. The current Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, is a Remainer. The impetus for the United Kingdom to save itself is to rejoin Europe. So although under Johnson and under the brief premiership of the lady whose name I've forgotten, they were proposing a Bill of Rights and remove the United Kingdom from the ECHR regulations and human rights regulations, but that hasn't happened. So the ECHR can make a decision and recommend a course of action to the United Kingdom. Again, with these supranational bodies, they don't have to obey, but in the past, in these sort of cases that Julian is making, the United Kingdom acquiesced to the determination of the European Court of Human Rights. But I'd like to, when you get down to these legal nitty-gritties, you don't get the feel of what's actually involved in happening. So if you could indulge me just for a second, I'll tell you something. There were 400,000 items in the Iraq war files, 92 or 95,000 in the Afghan war files, 250,000 in the cables, and the Guantanamo Bay files, about 45,000 items. One of the cables dealt with an incident. Now this is leaks can stop wars. So I'll illustrate that. Leaks can stop wars. Really important. They stopped a war. How'd that happen? In 2008, a group of American soldiers went into a house outside Baghdad, busted open the door and murdered all of the occupants, the mum and the dad and the babies and the boys and girls and uncles and aunts, grandfathers and grandmothers. Contemplating this heinous crime, they called in an airstrike and obliterated from Mother Earth for all time all remnants of that house and that little family. This was written up in a cable by the ambassador, the United States ambassador to Iraq, and sent to the Department of Justice. Chelsea Manning released it to Julian Assange. Julian Assange published it, and the people of that wrecked country, that destroyed nation, gathered up their courage, the like of which it's hard for us to imagine. Shock and awe and all that. Gathered up their courage and said, we are not signing the Status of Forces Agreement. And to my shame, one of the allies covered by that Status of Forces Agreement were Australian troops. We're not signing it, you've got to go. And so it stopped the war. The United States and its allies withdrew their troops, and the normalisation over a long period of time had stopped a war. That stopped a war. There are two others that I can quickly run across. So you know the import of what is done in our names by Julian Assange of WikiLeaks and the sum of this soil. The Chagos Islanders, you may know it as El Diego Garcia Air Force Base, the United States Air Force Base, where they house B-52 bombers, nuclear carrying bombers. The Chagos Islanders, there are 3,300 of them in the Chagos Islands. The United Kingdom packed them all up and dumped them in Mauritius. and gave Diego Garcia the largest island to the United States for an Air Force base, based upon the revelations in the cables. The Chagos Islanders and their lawyers took a case to the International Court of Justice and prevailed. They prevailed on the evidence that they could extract from the cables. The third one brings justice. The Guantanamo Bay files. Stephen Kenny, a lawyer from Adelaide, who's currently Julian's lawyer, back in those days represented David Hicks. David Hicks was in Guantanamo Bay for 5 years. Stephen Kenny and another lawyer established a NGO called Reprieve, Clive Stafford Smith from the United States, used those files, the Guantanamo Bay files, to bring about the release of David Hicks and several other prisoners. In the file, it had revelations of torture, like a United Kingdom citizen having pieces of his penis cut off as a matter of torture in Guantanamo Bay. So the files, those leaks, their import brought justice to people. So there's 3 items, magnificent, wonderful, powerful, that were brought to us by Chelsea Manning, WikiLeaks, Julian Assange.
And all of those files are very unflattering for some of the world's most powerful players. Is that the reason Julian Assange, the official reason that Julian Assange is still under lock and key, because he's obviously not been accused of any kind of violent crimes against any physical beings over in the UK? What is the official reason?
Well, that's the truth. They just don't want us to know, and they want to get away with crimes against humanity.
But have they actually stated a reason as to have the authorities in the UK given an official reason as to why it is that Julian Assange can't just wait in the community, say under house arrest or something like that, for the appeal?
No, but I can tell you that Julian is held incommunicado, that in court, in those circumstances that I described a little earlier, Julian stood up to say something, and the judge said, Mr. Assange, you're well represented here. If you say something again, I'll have you taken to the cells below the court, and the hearing will continue without you. That's the circumstance. Julian is held in a maximum security prison in order that he doesn't have a platform to speak for himself. That's all. In order that he doesn't have a platform to speak for himself.
Since we all kind of know and love you by now, after a few years of these visits and updates on Julian Assange, could we ask now for an update on him personally and his health in general?
Yeah, it sometimes rings in the morning, which is our evening, and I think, oh, it sounds all right. And then sometimes it rings in the evening, it rings in the morning. Sorry, yeah, he rings me in the morning, and it's his evening. I think, oh dear, he's slipping and sliding a bit. It's just the day wears on, people get worn out because of the 11 o'clock in his time that he's ringing. But I think you can be assured that with so much going on around the world now in defence of Julian and Australia, we keep this in mind, and it's important. The only country withstanding to defend Julian Assange is Australia, as he is an Australian citizen. We keep that in mind all the time. Nobody else can speak for him. The lawyers can defend him against accusation. You know. But the only country that can stand for Julian in face of the United States and the United Kingdom, or any country, is Australia. And we keep that in mind all the time. So we cannot excuse our government over the last 13 years for not doing more. I thank Anthony and Penny for seeing me and making public declarations that they're going to bring, they've made representations in that, and this is going to be brought to closure, and in the positive, we take that in the positive. It's really important. We see before our eyes a reform happening in the circumstances of DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which treats Australians overseas in trouble in an offhand, casual, indifferent manner. So we see that changing.
This will be my last question for you, and then we might open up the questions to the audience. And it's a pretty simple one. 3 things you've just said, how important it is for Australians to speak out for Julian Assange. So what are the 3 most simple, most effective things that ordinary Australians or extraordinary Australians could do to help support Julian Assange?
These are easy. You know, every parliamentarian has 2 lots of phone numbers. And they're, you know, the one in the Parliament House and the electoral office. Some have 2 electoral offices, but 3 phone numbers. All I have to do is ring them up and say, you know, when you go, what are you doing? Bring this Assange thing to an end. It's worrying everybody. It's a pest. Get it over with. 13 years, you know, your Prime Minister states this. That you can do. Or there's Ithaca.movie, which is a website, Ithaca.movie. You can host the movie. You can host it over dinner and have a chat and think, oh God, that fellow's a ball, or whatever. or I'm glad that's not my kid in that trouble, or whatever. You know, you can I mean, that's the glory of community. You can discuss among ourselves and not rely upon social media or a parliamentarian or a politician or a pundit to tell you how to think about these things. You can watch the movie and you can see the actual footage of people actually going about person to person fighting for a child. It's pretty real. You can do that easy. And the glory of that is that, well, it's face to face and it's a pretty special aspect. I think it's as an allegory. I'm starting to talk too much, but the ideas keep coming. I think there's an allegory in the Bible which goes to say, where 3 people are gathered together in my name, I will be there. This is an allegory for the truth. And a beautiful thing about us human beings. Where 3 people are gathered together to seek a truth or truths, truth will emerge. And we do it over dinner all the time. We have chats over dinner. And we leave the dinner table, or we leave afternoon tea or whatever your thing is, with another view, an improved view, and then we go to improve it again. I often make the Prometheus bound. Prometheus gave fire to human beings, so the gods were cross with him and strapped him to a rock, and the eagle came down and tore out his liver each day, and it regrew in the evening. So I make a parallel with Julian. But I add to that Percy Bysshe Shelley's Prometheus Unbound. How do you get out of the chains? What is the road to freedom? What is the way to freedom? Knowledge. Knowledge. And knowledge. And each little bit of knowledge brings you closer to the freedom. Of course, freedom never quite comes. But each bit of knowledge brings us that much closer.
John, I'm wondering...
I think we've got a microphone and it's being recorded, so please try to use the microphone if you're asking a question.
John, in terms of Prometheus and your mind's eye with putting yourself in the shoes of Anthony, no doubt, as you have many times, and given that last night I watched very depressingly Penny Wong and Richard Miles lining up there with Blinken and with the other sort of Secretary of State or Defence Minister there, saying that we're all the way with LBJ and Biden in this looming war with Taiwan. What do you think in the light of Gough Whitlam was rolled because he asked too many questions about Pine Gap and wanted to know what was happening on Australian soil, and you talk about your own son being a son of the soil and then from that ancient tradition of blood and sweat and tears and so on. What do you think is going on in the head of Anthony Albanese from the left faction, son of a single mother raised in the Housing Commission home in Camperdown, in terms of lining up with the United States, which might lead to a nuclear war with us and your son, a symbolic sort of innocent lamb that's been led to the slaughter because he dared to tell the truth about what the United States military-industrial complex does.
Gee, that's a tough question. You know, I'm the sort of one-issue guy at the moment, and when Julian comes home, I'll vigorously address those other issues. But as a witticism, until the last election, every election since 1975, I voted Gough Whitlam.
Every election there should be a blanket estimate to put your own.
I'm going to say this is nothing to do with asking President to make a comment, but when it comes to elections, I think every single election there should be a blank box and a line. Everyone can write their own election question or answer or anything I want to say. Yeah. Well, a bit louder? Okay. There should be a blank box to write in anything you want. So forget the census, just whack that in as well.
And I won't support that as someone who supports democracy and trying to make sure that everyone has an informed vote. So we can have a little debate about that later. Please don't waste your votes.
I'd just like to say I'm a father, and it makes me cry to see what you've gone through, and you're an inspiration, and I hope I never have to follow in your footsteps, that you've done a remarkable job, and I know you're going to succeed.
Thank I just look forward to having a big cook-up with old friends, drink a little bit too much, and Julian with his family wherever they end up, you know. But as a shy man having to run around the world, you know, and also, you know, the trajectory of life when you get across a few bridges, as most of the people here looking around have done, you just want to spend a bit of time with friends, stare out the window, have 2 fingers of whiskey about 11 o'clock at night, and put your head on the pillow and say, oh, thanks. You know, because you have to. I was with this poet in breakfast. She took me to breakfast in Mexico City. She's 92. Had his clearest face. The skin is like, you know, shining. Gentlest nature, but eyes fierce and sparkling. She gave me this advice. She said, go to bed early and give thanks. But I don't go to bed early, but I do give thanks.
Does anyone else have a question? Oh, beautiful. Oh, we have Pratima. How many more questions would you like to?
Yes, we've got 15 minutes more.
So, yeah, okay, a few more questions.
Well, it's not really a question, but I just want to say how important I think it is to speak truth to power, which is what I'm hearing tonight. And I think it's wonderful to hear truth, which is being spoken to power, and how wonderful that is. That's all I want to say.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Why do you think Albanese was such a cold fish? In opposition, he was like pro bringing in Julian home, and now he's been like just doing this really like slowed down kind of thing that maybe even the Liberal Party would do, of just like obfuscating everything and keeping the fossil. Anyway, the fossil fuel is another thing, and it's not staying in the ground. But with Julian, he needs to be alive. He needs to be back here, obviously. Why do you think there was so much obfuscation and he hasn't actually ever kind of went, okay, let's bring him home?
Yes, the quiet diplomacy.
You know, that with diplomacy they make this parallel or metaphor, if you like, of sausages. You don't want to know what they put in the sausage, you just want the sausage. Because what they make sausages out of is nobody's business, and that's diplomacy. So we just continue to pressure them to bring a result. That's what we want. I don't want to know how they go about it. I don't want to be involved in the negotiations. I just want the phone call from the newspaper saying, Julian's boarding an airplane. What you got to say about that?
Just to follow on from that, John, do you think they're scared of Julian still? Or do you think they still feel he's a threat? I mean, he could easily be elected Prime Minister of Australia if he was in his top form, but I doubt if he is in his top form anymore.
Yeah. So in the last 2 trips to Parliament, one was a couple of weeks ago, I was very impressed with the quality of parliamentarians, their broadness of vision, their intelligence, and their warmth of heart to me. But I was asked, what would Julian do? Would he go quiet for a year? Anyway, this proposal came up about a year and a half ago. You know, that question. I was asked that question in other places by similar people. So I rang Julian up and said, he rang me. I said, would you go quiet for a bit? He said, I'll be a Carmelite nun to get out of here. so
I think we still have a Carmelite monastery or convent, actually, in Lismore. So there's room, maybe.
Yeah, they are frightened. They're frightened that Julian will be vindictive and, societies in this current age or epoch are difficult enough to run. From their point of view, not mine, from their point of view, are difficult enough to run without having, a person who has 88% in the electorate calling them out for being this, that and the other. So I think it's more important to assure those in power that Julian's prime concern is not to be in jail, and second to that is to spend some time regaining his health.
John, I'm very happy to see you here, and I'm very happy that the movement is coming to some sort of culmination. I was very grateful to be with Stella when I left London 2 weeks ago on the last night, and her question, when we spoke, just really moved me, and I'm feeling my heart in it now. I said to her, if you could give one message to Albanese right now, what would that be? She went very quiet, and I felt the potency of this moment, and she looked me in the eyes and she said, Julian's life is in your hands. And in my experience of being there, being with the chain of 7,000 people around Parliament House trying to humanise the government, and meeting with her and the family, in that space, I felt it is crucial time right now that the pressure on the world that has been encroaching on Julian, it's absolutely essential that we bring him home now. That his health, his life is in the Prime Minister's hands right now. I ask you to share it with everybody and anyone here if there's anything else that we can do to bring the immediacy, the urgency, and the truth and righteousness of that decision now. May we all have the courage to do that, and that is our Christmas prayer.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think we've got a question
Yes,
over here.
on my way there. Do you think when Julian gets out, would he want to be back in Australia, or would he be in London living with Stella and the kids?
Oh, I don't know. I don't like London much these days. I hope he's nearby so I can pop in. I've gone off London since they've locked up.
Well, I think the question was, where does Julian want to live?
The funny thing is, all the kids grow up and they go live somewhere else, and you only have them so that they can be around the place.
Yeah, but he's got a kid in Mexico now too, so do you think he'll go to Mexico?
I don't know. Mexico, it's pretty wonderful. Mexico City's a joy, but they've got the foreign policy of one of their neighbours not so good.
Hi John, I wonder if you could just clarify, are we waiting for the UK High Court to decide whether they're going to hear the appeal, or have they decided they are going to hear the appeal?
So the single High Court judge has had all the papers from the defence and from the prosecution since the 31st of October. And so far, that single judge who decides only on paper, not in a court hearing, has yet to make a decision. So we await his decision. We hope it's coming before Chrissy.
Another question. Recently the ECHR ruled when the UK wanted to send immigrants to Rwanda. They decided, I think, 48 months at local council. Do you have any idea of how long this ECHR might take?
It depends upon what the defence have asked. I don't know. The papers that are submitted to the ECHR are held privately, so I don't know what
that's the European Court, Court of Human Rights. Commission? Yeah.
John, has there been any approach to King Charles at all? Like I was reading the legalese that's over there, it says that a pardon can be given by the monarch or by the governor, and that cannot be overturned by any court once it's given. Has there been an approach at all to those avenues?
So Philip Adams changed the heading on his petition and changed it to the Queen. And another person whose name I can't remember also approached the Queen, and the reply from the palace was that it's a political matter and consequently the palace can't have an opinion.
Is there one more question, Pratima?
I think that's it. So thank you very
We
much.
also thank Pratima from Turning Points for hosting this evening. And I know that Turning Points have been hosting a few politics in the club, tried to revive it after challenges in the past few years. So well done for making it happen.
Thank you.
And I do just want to do a shout out, I have to our local regional journalists who have, all of them are talking about ABC North Coast, I'm talking about the Northern Star, even when it was still owned, even now that it's owned by Murdoch, and before it was bought by Murdoch. Of course, the Byronshire Echo publications, and Bay FM Community Radio, Bay FM 99.9, which you can also stream at bayfm.org. We've all consistently covered the predicament of Julian Assange. So, well done to all those big news mastheads all around the world for catching up. Real progress always starts here in the Northern Rivers. Do we call that the butterfly effect? I think Bunjalung means land of many butterflies, something like that. So, yeah, thanks again.
Thank you, Mia Armitage, for coming along and having such stimulating questions to John. Really good. And John, you're amazing. Keep up the good work. We're all behind you. We give you all our love and support. And it will happen, I can feel it.
I just want to thank everybody, from the bottom of my heart, and just ask one request only. Next time we meet, can we be meeting in celebration of
All right, good night everyone. Thank you so much.